Hey robot fans, welcome back to the build. Today, we paint.
No, I will not be using a roller, but yes, I am painting today. So now my helmet is nice and smooth. I can start laying down the white. For this, I'm using Krylon Fusion for plastic. This is great for 3D printed parts. I used it for all of the white parts of BB-8, and it worked out really well. My general philosophy for spray painting is lots and lots of light coats. You shouldn't be getting too much coverage on any one particular coat. Sand as needed in between coats just to get rid of any bumps that you didn't catch before. And overall, you just want a really nice even cover because this is the foundation that all the other colors are going to go on. So it might be the simplest in terms of masking and skill, but it is definitely the most important.
Okay, all the whites are done. I think I did about 5 or 6 coats overall, made up of probably 3 subcoats each. So I was pretty much in and out all day, just giving it a little bit of paint here and there. The spray paint itself says that it's dry within a day, but it could take a full week to get that nice hard shell, and I tend to fully honor that request from the can. So this will sit for a week and let it really cure. My general rule with curing paint is if you can still smell it, it's not done yet, and I can definitely still smell the spray paint, so I'm going to let this sit in a nice dry space for the next week. So if you've been following my channel and saying, wow, why is this video taking so long to come out? That's because I am a full, die-hard, listen to the can drying instructions kind of guy. So we'll see you in a week. These are going to be the tools of the trade for the rest of this video. First off, we have Tamiya masking tape. This, to me, is the gold standard of masking tape. It's super thin, which makes it really easy to use and mask off curved edges. The tack on this is perfect. It's sticky enough to hold itself down, but it doesn't pull up anything on the other side. This is usually my first line of defense. It's the first line that goes down, and then I follow that up with regular blue painter's tape. I have that in 3 different widths as well. I'm going to be using liquid latex on all of the blue parts, which is coming up soon. This is going to be used for masking. I have a little pick here, which helps me get some of that latex off. A ruler for measurement, and a X-Acto blade here, which is good for both the sharp end of the blade and the blunt side of the blade, which really helps you get the tape into those corners that you need to get it into. I have some high grit sandpaper for fixing all my mistakes, and a pair of scissors to cut the tape.
I'm going to start by masking off the parts of the helmet that need to be painted gray. This includes the frown portion of the helmet, which is where the teeth are in front of the face, and a gray strip that goes all the way around the back of the helmet. I start with the Tamiya tape, which is super thin and it gives me good flexibility with the curved surfaces. I use the front and back edge of my X-Acto blade to really make sure that I'm hitting those lines that I want to hit. I cut the tape where I need to cut it and push it into corners where I need to push it into corners. Once I have that first layer of yellow Tamiya tape down, I start building on that with blue painter's tape until I have a good inch all around the parts that I'm trying to mask. At that point, I can start really building up with larger pieces of tape or pieces of paper just to get the whole helmet covered so that the only parts that are exposed are the frown and that strip going around the back. Now we're ready to paint, and this is my first chance to give a real bona fide painting tip. We are painting gray on top of white here, but the first thing I'm going to do is spray a layer of white. There's a lot of masking tape on this helmet, and the chances of there being no bumps or cracks or little tiny raises in that tape is pretty slim to none. By spraying a layer of white first, it fills any of those little tiny bumps with white paint so it doesn't leak through onto the helmet. This way, when we spray the gray, all those little cracks are filled and it'll be left with a much cleaner line. Next, we spray the gray. For this, I'm using Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 filler primer. I'm also being sure not to cover too much on any one coat again, and I hit this with about 2 or 3 coats. Okay, painting tip number 2. A lot of people say to wait until the paint is completely dried or dried overnight before you take off your masking tape. I don't necessarily subscribe to that theory. I like to take it off while it's still pretty tacky. So this paint, for example, says it's dry to the touch in 15 minutes and completely dry in an hour. I usually would probably wait about 20 to 30 minutes and then take my masking tape off and then let it dry completely before I do anything further. But taking off the tape while it's still a little bit wet is beneficial because then there's no real seals that get cracked by pulling that tape off and you end up with a nice even line. Taking off the tape and the paper can usually be a bit of an anxiety attack, but in this particular instance, I think I did pretty well. There's no real bleeds anywhere, and the lines are super smooth, so I'm really happy with this step. This is where the fun begins. We're going to start masking off the blue for the 501st look. Just like the previous section, we're going to start with the thin Tamiya masking tape. The costume reference library has a pretty good amount of information to follow for the measurements for this particular masking. It's really helpful. It takes a lot of the time out of the guesswork because there's a lot of gray areas when you start curving all this tape. So having these measurements is helpful. I started using the Tamiya masking tape to measure as well as to mask off. I was cutting little strips to certain lengths according to the measurements and applying them to the helmet, and then just lining up my masking tape to hit those individual measurements. This worked out really well, and I think I got the measurements right on the money. When all that's done, I can repeat the process of adding in the painter's tape layer by layer and adding paper where I need to cover larger sections of the helmet. When the whole helmet's covered and all that's left is the blue area that needs to be painted, we can start using the liquid latex to apply the battle damage. A lot of this masking will be pretty random, just adding dings and chips where I feel it's necessary, but there's one specific piece of damage that I really want to get right. If you look at the reference for Commander Bao from the Purge comic series, you can see that there's a pretty prominent X on the forehead area. It appears in a couple different panels, so it's definitely not a glare or just like a little artist rendition. It's definitely something that's supposed to be there, and since this is really the only reference we have for Commander Bao, I think it should be included. My first goal is getting this on the helmet. The liquid latex is super easy to work with. It smells a little bit like old balloons and it dries really, really fast, but for an application like this, it's perfect. I lay it down on the helmet, paint on top of it, and when everything's dry, the paint and the latex, you can just kind of peel it right off and it leaves these really nice crisp lines. With the X in place, I can just move randomly around the helmet and start adding different dings and dents where I need them to be. To apply it, I'm just using a little kid's paintbrush. This is all you really need. Whatever brush you ruin will pretty much be destroyed, so I wouldn't use anything you're too fond of. When this is all dry, we're ready for paint, and I start with the layer of white like we have in the past to fill in the gaps in the tape. Then it's on to the blue. For this, I am using Krylon Global Blue. This is the paint used in the costume reference library, and you'll notice in this video it's one of those colors that looks a little different in every single lighting scenario. It's really cool, and it's really perfect for matching the 501st clones from the Revenge of the Sith movie. I apply a few light coats in the morning and let it sit for about a half an hour. Now it's time to remove the tape. If I was nervous removing the tape for the gray section, you can imagine how nervous I'm feeling right now. I don't generally consider myself to be a great painter, but I gotta say, this blue section came out pretty good. There are a couple iffy spots, but nothing that can't be fixed, and my lines are looking really crisp. Now comes the coolest part of the painting section. I take my little pick here and I start removing the latex all around the helmet. I start with the X, of course, because I was so excited to see this. As soon as this starts coming off, I get really excited. I know this is going to look really cool, and I continue to go around the helmet getting all the latex off, and you can start seeing the finished helmet really coming out. With everything cleaned up, Commander Bao is really looking like a 501st trooper. Before I move on with the helmet with the black sections, I decided to keep the ball rolling on the blue and get the macrobinoculars painted. I kept one of the greeblies separate for this step, so I start by masking that off. There is an equally awesome list of measurements for the macrobinoculars in the costume reference library, and compared to the size of the helmet, this goes really quickly and real easily. I add the liquid latex just like I did for the helmet, add a couple coats of paint, and peel everything off, and it looks just as good as the helmet does. I'm super excited with how the blues came out. I glue the greebly back onto the main set of the macrobinoculars, and we are ready to move on to the black part of the helmet. The black takes up the least amount of real estate on the helmet. It's really just the chin greebly at the bottom and the brim of the main lid. I decided to tackle the chin greebly by hand using some Liquitex basic black acrylic paint. I have some decent artist's brushes that give me the control I needed to get into those tight little spots. This went pretty well, so I decided to continue right on painting by hand with the main brim. This, however, did not go quite as well as the rest of the paint has. I think doing it by hand made the masking of the single strip of masking tape less effective with all my poking and brushing, and the line was really choppy all around. I spent an extra hour or so just remasking little sections and touching things up, and in the end it looks really great, but if you're watching this video for advice on how to paint your helmet, I'd say my advice would be to use spray paint for the black brim. Take the time to tape up the rest of the helmet and do it with the spray paint. Continuing right along with the black, I also finished off the ear greeblies. This had already been sprayed with the gray Rust-Oleum primer while I was sanding and finishing them, so all that's left to do is tape off the little base plate and paint it black. After these are dry, I can go right into their little magnetic homes. At this point, the finish line is in sight, and there's only one task left to perform, painting on the cheek stripes. You can purchase some nice stencils from the builders forums and stick them right onto the helmet, and these will mask out the stripes for you. It's a little difficult to stick a flat sticker onto a round surface without some crimping, but for the most part they lay pretty nice. Since I learned nothing from past mistakes, I decided to hand paint this using some navy blue acrylic paint I had on hand. I painted several coats and made sure the color was full, and of course, disaster. As I peeled off the stencil, the paint had dried to a nice rubbery shell, and the stencil took a lot of the paint with it. After a few minutes of ranting and raving and cursing and shouting, I decided to see if I could make something happen with this. The stencils did leave enough of an indication of the stripes for me to go in and manually tape them off and repaint them. This, combined with some needling and some X-Acto blading, led to a really nice result I couldn't be more happy with. I like the color, and it has like a really nice weathered look that goes well with the top of the helmet, and when the whole thing is weathered, this is just going to look awesome. I'm really happy with how this came out, despite the initial disaster. So next we just attach the macro binoculars, we screw them into each side and add their appropriate greeblies, and we're good to go.
I set up a DIY photo shoot here in the workspace just to kind of document the progress so far. The photos came out really good. You can check them out on my new Instagram account. Yes, I finally got an Instagram account. I've really been enjoying it and posting pretty regularly, so if you want to see some stuff that happens in between the videos, definitely check out my Instagram account. I think that's going to do it for this video. We got the helmet fully painted today, which is a huge step. Next up will be weathering, where we're going to make this thing look nice and dirty. Really excited for that. As always, we're going to finish with a progress shot, so thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.